Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 53.
Hateful and sexist phrases like "your body, my choice" and "get back to the kitchen" are getting millions of clicks online.
These kinds of hostile, aggressive, or critical posts and messages targeting political entities, individuals, or groups are common on social media. Are they just harmless noise, or could they be shaping how we feel about politics and democracy itself? In an era where the outrage machine dominates our feeds, understanding how exposure to hostility impacts our emotions and political attitudes seems important. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and on this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast, we're looking into the psychology of anger, cynicism, and the subtle yet profound ways our online experiences influence the democratic process. Our guest is a scholar whose research uncovers how different emotions, like anger and anxiety, affect our political engagement.
I'm Ariel Hasell. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Michigan in the Department of Communication and Media. I'm also a faculty associate at the Center for Political Studies. And I study essentially how social media are shaping the way we think about politics.
Ariel Hasell and a team of researchers published findings in a paper titled "When Social Media Attack: How Exposure to Political Attacks on Social Media Promotes Anger and Political Cynicism." This research explores how exposure to political attack posts on social media influences individuals' emotional responses, specifically anger, and fosters political cynicism. With a deep understanding of the intersection of media, politics, and psychology, Ariel Hasell brings insights that will resonate with anyone concerned about polarization, democracy, and how we navigate today's digital landscape. Stay with us as we unpack this fascinating discussion and discover what these findings mean for all of us. Let's get to it. Ariel Hasell, thank you so much for making time for our little program.
Great. I'm happy to be here.
So I saw this paper and I thought, okay, well, some of it seems like a little bit of a well, duh. It seems like, talking about how, attacks on political media can make us more cynical. But at the same time, we do have to have real data on this stuff. And I think there are some interesting, unique conclusions in this paper. The paper talks about how these political attacks can lead to emotions like anger and anxiety, and then that can lead to other things such as cynicism, but they're not necessarily the same. Like the different emotions can have different impact there. Can you talk about that a little bit and maybe what that says about the sort of nuances of how these emotions affect our political attitudes?
Yeah, so we know that emotions work slightly differently, right? That anxiety is this negative attitude driven by uncertainty, and anger, we think of anger as negative, but anger can be very rewarding sometimes. It's what we call an approach emotion. There's sort of a deliciousness sometimes in reveling in anger, especially if you feel you have the moral high ground. So we know that when people are seeing these attacks on social media, what we were able to show is that it's triggering this anger response, but not necessarily the anxiety response. So it's not that people are feeling threatened by this environment, they're just getting outraged by it. And one of the key things that we found in our paper is that it's not all social media use. If you're just using social media to scroll funny animal videos, keep in touch with your friends, or even if you're using social media for news about current events and politics, but not seeing a ton of hostility, that we don't see the same outcomes related to anger and cynicism. So there's a really interesting sort of idea in there that if you're seeing political hostility, or at least perceiving that you're seeing a lot of political hostility, because we don't actually know how much people are exposed to it. It might be that some people are seeing perfectly normal conversations, but are perceiving it as hostile because there's some sort of level of disagreement there that's really bugging them. And so that this is sort of driving the cynicism and the anger and cynicism that we're seeing. So I wanted to sort of start off by saying that it's not that all social media is doing this, right? There's some user experience and decisions that users are making that are actually impacting sort of these outcomes.
I wonder about, I was kind of trying to resolve what seems like an inconsistency that, these studies that say apathy is increasing, but then we also see like these really high voter turnouts. But I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think we used to think of cynicism as like automatically equating with apathy, and that's just not necessarily what we're seeing right now. We're seeing cynicism is really high, but interest and motivation is also really high. And I think it's in part because the stakes feel much higher than they did 20, 30 years ago in terms of individual rights, in terms of the existence of democracy. We've always had lots of polarization and lots of arguing and lots of differences, but the feeling that sort of democracy is on the line, whether you're on the right or the left, and like the very systems are in play is incredibly motivating, even if you're very cynical towards the people who are running these systems.
And we've sort of touched on this a little bit, but I want to dive a little deeper on it. That this cynicism can make you cynical, but can also mobilize you, and this could lead towards more extremist views and potentially anti-democratic mobilization as well. You talk about, and that's something we're kind of quite a bit concerned here. We talked to a lot of folks about that kind of thing, and these tendencies. So So what can you say about that? I mean, are there asymmetries, or is this pretty universal in terms of parties? Are there other asymmetries, or is it unique to the U.S. maybe because of our two-party system? I don't know if any of that triggers some conversation.
Yeah, so we found some asymmetries. We know that people on the right tend to be more cynical about institutions and systems than people on the left. But it's by no means like a conservative or Republican thing. It's happening everywhere. It just is a bit more extreme on the right. And I think, part of that's happening, that's really people feel like that this has been happening for a long time and everything is always unprecedented and the news is always breaking, that there's this sort of exhaustion where people feel like the only thing left to do is to kind of burn it down. Like, let's take it out. Let's, rather than thinking about the actual rebuilding and participating. Like, democracy is hard work, and it's always hard work. You're treading water constantly throughout the whole history of democracy, right? Like, you're always having to work to keep everybody afloat. And I think that people get tired. And some people can get tired sometimes, but if all of the people are tired all of the time is when we start losing it. And it starts looking really, really easy to just say, like, you know what? That guy says he's going to fix all my problems. And so I'm just going to let him do it. And if he doesn't do it, I'm just going to blame everybody else.
Mm-hmm. And do you think the U.S. is particularly more susceptible to this, or do you think this is pretty evenly throughout the world?
I think that this is happening in a lot of places around the world. We see very similar patterns of kind of news avoidance and cynicism happening around the world. I think what is particular to the U.S. is how much everyone in the U.S. distrusts the news media. We know that Republicans and conservatives have been very sort of hostile towards news media for a while, and very distrusting of it. But we're seeing it's declining all across the board, even among Democrats. And, to the point where people sort of almost think it's sophisticated to not believe the media. They're like, oh, well, I'm not somebody who actually believes what journalists tell me. And I don't have any particular empirical evidence of this, but I really get the sense that it's this distrust in sort of the messenger and the news media that is prevents us from being able to rebuild some of those other institutions, because if there's no credible source of information, there's really not much you can do with that. And so what we've seen in some of this work and other work is that when people on the left become more overwhelmed by the information environment, they actually lean into more nonpartisan news. So they start consuming sort of more legacy news media. So when you start thinking of people on the left, when it seems chaotic, they're going to start going to, let's say, CNN or New York Times or the NBC Nightly News, into those sources that are more institutionally secure and safe. On the right, what we see is that people tend to just opt out of news more, when because they don't really trust the institutional journalism. And so when things get chaotic and the information environment feels threatening and scary, they opt out. Of course, some people go to more extremist types of media, and that happens on both the extreme right and the left. But sort of overall, you have one party that's more inclined to sort of go to the nonpartisan media, and one party that's more inclined to just be like, you know what, I'm just opting out.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, and what, I recently did an episode with Osa Vikforce and the Knowledge Resistance Project.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like one of the challenges we have there is most of us just aren't very good at navigating that complex information ecosystem.
Well, it's really hard. I mean, I sometimes try and get my students to ask a really simple question or answer a really simple question. What is news? And it's amazing how complex that question is, even for journalists, even for scholars, because we have sort of a set of ideas of what news is, but in social media environments and other digital environments, it's very strange, right? There's things that are news and things that are news-ish and things that are quasi-journalistic commentary. And it's really hard to tell who has any business speaking on any particular topic. Because it's all these sources sort of become blurred. So a lot of people, especially young people, I find, who think that they're consuming news media are not actually consuming any journalism or any sort of remotely journalistic sources. They're just consuming commentary on news. And we know that people are just not as informed, and that sort of commentary is more negative, it's more polarized, it's more factually inaccurate. So just the question of like how to get people who want to be news consumers to actually consume news can be really difficult, because the boundary of what news is has been so blurred in the last 20 years.
One of the things that when I talk to people that always bothers me is there's not a lot of awareness of some of these aspects, like you're saying, what is news? And one aspect of like real news is there's sort of a process. There's like a mechanism. I'm not getting the word right, but there's like a mechanism for peer review and sort of they have editors more or less, right, in the journal side, and in academia you have the whole peer review process.
And absolutely. And there's work by some of my colleagues at University of Texas, Austin, that have shown when you explain to people what journalism is and the process of reporting and fact checking and editing and all of that, all of a sudden the credibility of news goes up. Like if you just explain to them, wait, here's what news actually does. So that does make a difference. As far as like what we can do, I don't necessarily study the solutions, but I have a couple of ideas. And my ideas are I'll share them with you, but they're really focused on what individuals can do. But the easiest thing would be for social media companies to do a better job of prioritizing good information. The easiest way out that Facebook took is say, you know what, we're just going to suppress political information and not amplify it. And that's just such an easy solution for them and not a good one for democracy. So I think part of it is sort of we, the people who are deeply involved and intensely interested, need to start considering that maybe our hot takes aren't really helping anybody. And that, your hostility, consider whether or not it's like a cheap trick. And if it is, maybe sit and think about what you really want your contribution in the world to be. That's not to say that you can't ever have a hot take, but like, is this needed? Is sort of considering that you might actually be part of the problem here. And then the other thing is consider seeking out like actual journalism. Most people say that they're interested in politics and say that they want, news media that is unobjective and sober and unbiased and all of these things. But that's not the news they consume, if they're even consuming news. We consume news at alarmingly low rates in the US, like shocking compared to the rest of the world. And so there's this paradox of like, we totally don't trust the news, but we're also not watching it. We're watching this other stuff that's like quasi news, right? And then the other part is this sort of norms around civil discourse and hostility. And I think we have to just stop getting so offended when somebody insults us, like our party or our particular view. Like not everyone is going to agree with us. And even if we can prove that we are right definitively, like oftentimes you can't convince people. And that doesn't mean you should stop working to build a democracy or a better society. But maybe don't take it personally that some people are just jerks, right? Like, don't waste your effort getting really offended by them. There are, of course, people who are saying terrible, horribly offensive things, and like that's okay to get upset about, and we should be upset about those things. But a lot of people seem to get really deeply offended by pretty minor insults or perceive a lot of hostility in what is actually a perfectly reasonable view, but that it's just slightly different from their own. And so I think that there's this sense that we have to remember that like we kind of can control our outrage a little bit. And being so reactionary to every comment we see online is not doing us a world of good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And it can be hard. I mean, all these things can be hard to do in real life as well.
Oh, yeah, I don't make promises that doing any of those things is going to cure your political cynicism.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you can do a lot of these things for yourself. You can still sometimes get frustrated with sort of the larger system because you can only do so much about that. Like we can't necessarily force social media to behave better and things like that. One thing I noticed along these lines, and I don't know if you've seen this or you have any thoughts about it, is people, that we sort of live in this fantasy world a little bit that those views, we can sort of make those views go away. Like somehow we can win this argument and all opposing views will go away. And we'll only be happy. We won't be happy until we get to that point. And, and I think not that many people are talking about how to get more comfortable with the fact that these opposing views aren't going anywhere.
Yeah, I've often, I'm not like a cultural scholar of any, but I feel like we in America are so uncomfortable with disagreement that within party, any kind of intra-party conflict where you might have slightly different views than the rest of your party, quickly becomes sort of a litmus test of whether or not you belong in the party. And I think that can be quite dangerous because even within a party, you should have differing views, even if you have sort of the same general overview, because there's frankly just never one right way to do things. And I do feel like that disagreement, you have to realize that there's going to be a subset of the population that is going to vote for the candidate that you don't want, even if they're very well informed, and it's hard to imagine why somebody could think so differently from you, but that happens. And the good thing is you don't have to convince everybody, right? Like we live in a democracy, you just need to convince 51% of the people of something. And you don't necessarily need every person on your side to create progress or to sort of get the legislation that you want. And so it's about, well, how do we make sure we're reaching those right people and trying to make sure that that if you're going to argue online with people, is that the best use of your time, right?
Yeah, exactly. And we talk a lot about that, and it's good to get feedback. I do get feedback from listeners about this, that some of them, these things we can do individually, do help people, but there's still often there's kind of this underlying, but I'm not doing enough to sort of change these bigger things. I mean, regarding social media platforms, you mentioned it a little bit, but I mean, do you have any, like, if we could, wave a magic wand, what are some things you think they could do to improve the situation?
Well, I don't know that there's much we can do legislatively for First Amendment reasons, but if somebody made me CEO of Facebook tomorrow, I think that we know what kinds of information is good. And I think if I were the CEO of Facebook, I would be developing partnerships with news media and making sure they get paid for the content that's on there, because part of the reason why news is struggling so much is the numbers are down. They're having a hard time keeping newsrooms staffed. And so Facebook makes a lot of money off of news and people using Facebook as a news. I'm picking on Facebook, but really it's all social media sites.
Mm-hmm.
And giving news organizations cuts of the traffic would be one way to get sort of dollars back in newsrooms and get journalists who are actual sort of fact-finding journalists on the job would be one way to do that. The algorithms that they have that they design them to maximize shareholder profit, which that's their role, and that's how they see their role in the world. But if you wanted to design those algorithms to maximize democracy, you could. I don't think that's happening anytime soon, but you could amplify good information, separate sort of actual news and journalism from political commentary, not avoiding any political commentary, because a lot of it is really interesting and really thoughtful, and there's nothing wrong with people having takes about things. So there are a few things that you could do were you in, if you had the levers of the algorithm at your disposal.
Right. I want to jump back to what you said at the beginning of that and just drill down on that a little bit. You said that we know what good information is, I think was what you said. And, I think we're challenged to agree on that. I think there's a lot of people I've heard people say that the term misinformation alone is like an off-putting thing. Like they hear somebody say that and they immediately think there's some kind of a deep state, you're trying to infringe my free speech or whatever. And I've even seen people attack papers that talk about better ways to reduce instead of fact checking, do something else and other interventions. And they get mad thinking this is some kind of a deep state attack on my First Amendment rights. And I'm curious, do you think we really can have a consensus on what is good information?
Can we have a consensus on what is good information? I mean, the short answer is no. We're never all going to agree on what is good information. But we know that some information is more verifiable than others, and is there are things that are facts that represent reality. And I think prioritizing those types of information, sort of like the who, what, where, when, how, of journalism, and it's always the why that is more debatable, right? But there are facts exist in the world. And so I think that having a consensus on that is not necessarily possible, but there are some people who are never going to be satisfied unless all the information agrees with them. And I'm not sure that those should be the audiences that we're catering towards.
Right, because again, we're kind of back to that. There's a misperception here that those people kind of dominate, when in reality they're clearly a minority. But they can be the ones that bother us the most because it is out there in our faces so much. And
they are certainly the most bothersome. Yeah.
Yeah, it can spoil your day. Another one in this sort of larger thing is we, beyond sort of talking about the things we can do individually, is the elites the political elites tend to have so much, and the pundits, and you sort of know what I mean by political elites, but for the audience, it's sort of like those are the candidates, these are the elected officials, these are the pundits, these kind of people that have a lot more influence. I mean, and it's because of the things you talked about before and the things we talk about on the show a lot. They have so many incentives for this kind of because it's kind of working to keep the base riled up. They have so much incentive to kind of use this kind of rhetoric and this style. I mean, do you think? I mean, I guess it's a person becomes a movement is really the best answer. But I don't know if you have any larger ideas of can we do anything to maybe make them do this less and participate in more civil ways?
I think that they will respond to the ballot box. And so that means we have to keep showing up, even if it feels futile, even if it feels like, well, I just saved democracy in the last election. How come I have to do it again in this election?
But what I would say about that is people on my side are doing it too, and I still have to go vote for them, right? Quote unquote, my side.
Right. And I mean, I think that is, well, long term, I feel like we need to start building the infrastructure for a multi-party system and rather than a two-party system. But that's a solution that if we started today would probably still be 50 years out, because we need more than just the least bad option to vote for. But I do think that we see wins when the majority of people are feeling one way about something, it tends to their views tend to be represented in the long run. And we have lots of little wins we can point to. And so reminding people that like it does in any given election, the outcome might not be what you want, but you probably at least got some outcomes that you want, right? Like it's never just one thing. There's in any election, you're voting for 100 different, or not 100, but like 37 different sort of votes. And that all of those, some of them you're winning, and it's worth kind of showing up and doing that for those purposes. And eventually, I think we just have to hope that we get a new guard of people in both parties that are a little more in touch with what the American people are trying to do with themselves and their society.
Yeah, although some people would call that mob rule, right? So I think we have to be careful there as well. One thing I love, I just wish we had a better appreciation or more, we championed, more bipartisan support and bipartisan participation instead of making it, sort of getting mad at our own people when they and using language like I'm not going to compromise. Well, like democracy is often compromised, buddy. We should be championing sometimes that you have, and I get it. You may have your issues you don't want to compromise on, but in real life, most things are going to require compromise to move forward. And I wish we could just get more sort of comfortable with that.
Yeah, and I think part of that, when we make every issue sort of a moral issue, it becomes unacceptable to compromise on it. Part of I worry that we are sort of socializing a generation of people to understand politics through a very, very moral lens. And not that there aren't morals involved, but the idea that you either are 0 or 100 and there's no in between, removes a lot of the nuance and makes discussion a little bit impossible and makes compromise impossible. So I don't necessarily have a solution to that, but that I think is a big driver in a lot of these discussions of outrage and polarization, these topics that you talk about so much on your show, that seeing everything as such a black and white, you're either on the side of good or on the side of evil, can be very detrimental to progress.
Well, and that's one of those things you can do personally too, is to try to do that less yourself. Even if that doesn't achieve these bigger things, that will help you personally quite a bit to try to do that a lot less. Be a lot less stressed out.
I tell my friends who are very cynical about politics, that essentially, like, if you're, the more cynical you are, the more the people you don't want to win are winning. Just in that sense, like if you have to sort of stay motivated and still believe that sort of change can happen, because there's a lot of people who are investing tons of money to make you feel like that's impossible. So not letting them win is kind of important.
Right. It kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And that's not like necessarily even a right or left thing. That's right. There's a lot of other actors in the information environment besides Democrats and Republicans. Right,
exactly. And often they'll try to bucket that into one of those other categories just so but yeah, there's many people that have, they'll work with either side, but they want their agenda independent of party. Well, we've talked about a lot of these sort of challenges. Do you have any sort of final message of sort of hope or optimism you can share with us?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that as cynicism becomes the norm in politics, it's almost like even like cool in our cultural zeitgeist, right? To sort of like, oh, are you surprised? Oh, well, I don't believe anything I read. That there's that sort of, people tend to think of themselves as very culturally sophisticated if they're cynical about things. And I think that we need to start thinking about sort of earnestness and credulity as actually a radical act. That believing that things are possible is, even if it's a little cringe and people aren't really into that right now, like it's actually kind of a radical thing to do.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's so true. And yeah, right. Sometimes these sort of oddly left field kind of things, it's the courage to do the thing that's not the cool thing right now. And then it becomes the cool thing later, maybe, which would be great.
Yeah. And it'll cycle back the other way at some point, I'm sure.
All right. Well, Ariel, Hasell, thank you so much for making time for our show again. I really enjoyed our conversation.
All right. Thank you so much.
And that is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.